Indiana Disability History Project, Indiana Institute on Disability and Community, Indiana University. Muscatatuck Oral History, Cindie Underwood, October 22nd, 2004.
Cindie Underwood and Steve Savage, Jenny Todd, and it's October 22nd.
October 22nd, okay.
We're here at Muscatatuck. So we're just here to talk about your experiences and how you got here and what you've been doing for the last few years and what's your reaction to things moving and changing and eventually closing, and start out maybe with just how you got interested at all in working here.
Well, out of college, I went to DSI. Found out that I could do a little bit better here, and DSI was ready for me to move on as well. So in 1989, I came to Muscatatuck as a case manager. Stayed on as a case manager for 9 years, and went to evening shift administrator, and took a brief period of time off after a couple of years of that. Came back as a social worker, and then got into transitions about the same time that it became more and more evident that we really were going to close the facility. So I've been working in transitions for, well, since I did a lot of that in my social work days too, about 3 years now.
I've been really interested in because you live in this area and you've lived in this area all your life, and just kind of the whole...
Don't rub it in, Steve.
just the whole deal. I didn't mean it that way. I meant it positively.
Now I'm depressed.
the whole milieu around just the idea that this is such a big employer, was such a big employer, and how much influence did that have on your decision making and working here? And I mean, did you feel like you had other places to go? Did you have and I know some of your history, of course, but I'd rather hear it from you. So,
well, my grandmother, Elizabeth Underwood, was a night shift supervisor out here for 1,000,000 years. My father thought this was the worst place in the world that anyone could ever work. And I imagine had he been alive at the time that I put in my application here, I wouldn't have.
Why did you think that?
Well, he didn't have a whole lot of respect or affection for the disabled.
Okay.
And he didn't have very much respect or affection for the atmosphere out here, which was pretty much a Peyton Place kind of atmosphere. It was pretty wild out here when there were a lot of employees and a lot of clients, and he got to hear the good, bad, and ugly from his mother once in a while.
Can you tell us some stories around that?
I wasn't allowed to know at that age, but no, I've heard some stories. There was a lot of promiscuity out here among the staff, and issues with client abuse and with clients being abusive towards staff, things like that. And to be perfectly frank, I don't think my father was the most stable person in the world, but that was one thing that he said: over his dead body would I ever work out here. And then I went to college and studied psychology, which, getting only a bachelor's degree, extremely limited me, especially in this area. If I wanted to stay in southern Indiana close to my family, then I was going to have to go to one of a couple or three employers at that time. So that was before we had a whole lot of... We had only a couple providers of services. DSI is probably the biggest one. And here, of services working with MR populations. And I didn't realize at the time I was in college that basically with a bachelor's degree, that was pretty much the population you're going to be able to work with. If you want to do counseling and you want to work with more average Joe citizens, you're probably going to have more advanced degrees. So that it's kind of a default thing. It wasn't what I was interested in when I went to college, but I did need a job and I wanted to remain in the area, so this is where I came eventually. And found that I had some affection for the job. Liked the people I was working with, both the clients and the other staff. Found a lot of things that needed to be changed around here, but that was about the same time things were really starting to change. So I felt like I was actually being part of a system that was on its way up, that was improving. We were making homes look more like homes, trying to downplay the institutional atmosphere. There was a whole lot more emphasis on active treatment and what we could be doing to make people's lives better. Of course, in old history that I wasn't here to see, but that I heard about from other people, there was some improved quality of life because people actually worked. People had the farm and they took care of things in the orchards and things, and people had some sense of value in that. But I think there was a period of time in between that period of time and the last 10 years when there was less value and there was not as much expected of people. So
You must have known people that went through that period where it was a farm, people that still lived here when you first started. Do you remember the stories that they told, any of the discussion around that?
I don't remember specific stories as much as I remember people remembering fondly things. I do remember some stories about the recreational things that would happen. There would be water balloon fights, and people would have watermelon out on the hearth, and it sounds a little like rush day on a college campus. There was a lot of horseplay, things we could never get by with now. People were having too much fun for what the Medicaid standards would call for. Heaven forbid someone slip and sprain an ankle while they were having too much fun.
Spitting watermelon seeds.
Spitting watermelon seeds, yeah, those kinds of things. But I think that there was that period of time when people's quality of life was pretty good because it was in a family atmosphere. As far as I have known several of the clients who have worked on the farm, who've worked with the cattle and worked in the orchard and different things, but other than just stories that they used to work, I don't remember specifics too much. I think I was kind of on the fringe of that. Those stories were mostly already told and forgotten.
Yeah. I want to spend more time talking about what has been your history, but just a couple more things just because they keep showing up in different places. Your grandmother would have been here at a time when there were what they called working girls. And do you have any recollection from her or stories from her about that? Was that?
No, not so much, really.
Okay.
I do know that my grandmother was very attached to several of the clients that she worked with. As a rule, more the low functioning, though. She would bring people home with her and things, and I got to meet several people from out here in that way. But I was very, very young, and my father didn't approve of all that, so I was kind of sheltered. And we immediately moved away from the area a little bit, all the way from Butlerville to DuPont. It was, it's that 10 miles, that separates the generations. But no. Now, my other grandmother did work out here also for a short period of time. And she had told me stories of abuse, kind of how people would carry their keys on a string and, smack someone with their keys if they weren't, doing just the right things. And that was pretty much reserved for the higher functioning people who I think that they felt had a little bit better sense of right versus wrong. And I think that the people who used to work were subject to a lot of that kind of thing. And then the thing that really surprised me was that I would hear these stories, and my grandmother would tell them as if she was a participant, but without any apology. There was a completely different mindset than there is now, and it was really kind of sad, and it just made me happy that I wasn't here then.
Sort of they deserved it.
Kind
sort of attitude.
Everyone was, and I still have seen this once in a while, even today. People being almost blamed for their disability, and not much of a degree of empathy for them, but when you smear feces, you make my life miserable, kind of thing. Not you're disabled and you don't know the difference between doing this and not doing this. This is kind of a depressed area, and I think people are depressed, and they don't have a whole lot of sympathy for others or even ability to try to put themselves in someone else's place. So And I know this is something that happens in all disabled populations everywhere today and yesterday, and it probably will still happen tomorrow. But then we have some great people who absolutely love the folks they work with, and who get great results with them. So.
The question of kind of hierarchy within the population is an interesting one for me. So that there were certainly people that were considered higher functioning and lower functioning and all over the map. Talk a little bit about that and the difference in the way they were during your time here. How were they? Were they separated? If so, how? What was the response to that? Just the whole kind of sense of the difference between the pecking order.
The pecking order, how people were treated and
is there
Well, I came in '89, so what I observed mostly was that people were separated based on their ability and their capacity. The first population I worked with was profound, non-ambulatory people who really you would be doing good to get eye contact from. They weren't the most medically fragile people who lived on the hospital unit, but they were folks that were very challenged. And as far as a pecking order within the group, there really wasn't one, because the folks that I was working with at that time didn't have a sense of alpha beta status. They were all being cared for, given complete direct care by staff people. I think that you would find, and I did have some notice, that the professionals and the direct care staff who worked with that population might be considered a little less than the folks who work with higher functioning people. You know.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, there was, I think there was a little bit of a sense that once you did your time and you had better skills, either as a professional or if you were a better DST, that you would be able to work with the higher functioning people. That, it didn't take much skill to write a program plan for someone who wasn't going to meet a goal anyway. And there was, I remember over the 4 to 5 years that I worked in that population being extremely frustrated trying to get eye contact from someone who didn't know what that person, didn't know their own name, didn't know why they should look at this ball, didn't know why they should smile, didn't know why they should reach and grasp, those kind of things. And I found that was probably the worst burnout I've ever had, was trying to reach people at the extreme profound range intellectually. And maybe I'm projecting a little bit. Maybe the sense of lack of value was, part of it was my own sense of lack of value, because I wasn't achieving anything other than feeding a paper tiger that was going to keep the Medicaid dollars rolling in. And I think that there was a whole lot of things that we did out here that was just to meet Medicaid standards that really none of us, professionals, direct care staff, any of us ever saw any real value in. We saw value in giving good direct physical care. We saw value in, trying to improve people's quality of life by making them laugh if they could, by giving them affection and kind tone of voice, those kind of things. But as far as the value in meeting the Medicaid standards and the training, we didn't. Now back to your original question of how did we see the pecking order develop in the clients? That was something I saw more when I started working in populations that were just a little less homogeneous, or when you would get into the populations of people who were more severe, and then up to the people who were more moderate, you would see there was no way to put people who were at exactly the same level together. And one thing that I will always think is odd is the higher functioning clients, referring to the people that I had worked with earlier, and anyone who was a little less able as low grades.
Low grades, low grade. That term, huh?
Low grade, yeah. People were low grades if they were, and that had to be something that they picked up from staff. You work with the low grades. And I don't know initially it was probably just like the terms idiots, morons, and those things, when it was just kind of a way to identify a population, and then it turns into a derogatory term. So low grade might have been, low, like we use low functioning, which is now a derogatory term, I'm sure profound will be a derogatory term in the future, but the higher functioning clients, the people in the higher range of intellectual development, I don't even know what's politically correct for me to say right now, but they certainly picked up on that. And like I said, I wasn't here when the working girls, people who actually cared for other clients, were there, and I haven't heard very many firsthand stories about it, but I do understand that they, to some extent, a lot of them were like almost adoptive towards the lower functioning people, and sometimes, just like the staff, they would be more maternal, sometimes they'd be more abusive. Everyone's got a personality, and they just feed into that.
I've only heard from one male, and that was, actually I should remember this guy real well. Somebody I worked with at DSR too.
It wasn't Leonard, but it was something along those lines.
No. And you would know him well too, but he'd lived out here for a long time. He's still in Columbus. At the workshop. I'll think of his name in a minute. But anyway, he talked about he was in that kind of a position too. So I guess it wasn't just working girls. Although most of the men that I've heard about were involved in the farming operations and those kind of course. I mean, that would be traditional, of course.
Right.
But
He described it as if he did some attendant care. I mean, he
Yeah.
moved people from place to place. He helped people get dressed. He, sounds like pretty hands-on.
and I'll think of it, you'll know exactly what.
Daryl.
Okay.
Just it'll come up. But yeah.
So,
So there were women who actually were kind of acted as attendants, but who were actually residents as well. Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And I don't believe that they were in paid positions. I could be wrong. I don't think that they had paid positions so much. I think they might have worked for an extra cup of coffee or something like that. That there wasn't. And I think that was kind of a big part of where the farm went and those kind of things, was because people were basically being forced into labor and not reaping any benefit.
those were some of the stories we've heard from people that were here 30 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
Is that, yes, there were a lot of working girls, and that was the argument. They weren't being paid, but people loved doing that. And then when they weren't allowed to do that anymore because of lack of money, then people were, pretty unhappy. Didn't have anything to do.
Right. Well, in the atmosphere of liability, I don't think that you could let someone do caretaking roles, with another person who is less capable, who wasn't an employee.
Well, back to the hierarchy a little bit, when you were talking about some of the different names, like low grades, were there other names for people or different people with disabilities that they referred to as groups, or was there any more status? Or was it just pretty much the higher functioning versus the lower functioning that you were describing?
I wasn't part of that to know much about it. I'm sure you get better information from someone who's been here longer. I've only had 15 years, and I think I missed most of that.
So you don't see any of that now, or there's no pecking?
Oh, as of now? Oh, yeah, there's a pecking order, but it's no different than the pecking order anywhere. There's people who want to assert their dominance, and I almost think it would be wrong to expect there not to be a pecking order, because it's human nature. And I think you would be asking folks who reside here not to have that aspect of human nature that we all have. But yeah, and it's not just that a higher functioning client who's more verbal will be dominant over a person of lesser verbal skills, but the bigger client might be more aggressive towards the smaller client, or vice versa. We have a situation that I know of where the little client's a real terrier and he's very feisty and he bullies the big client around. So it's just human nature. It's not the best part of human nature.
Right, but it's real. So what's it like here around holidays?
Well, I think because so many of the staff have to work here, there's always the nursing and the direct care staff. I think that they've always tried to make the holidays here as pleasant for the clients as they are for themselves, because it makes their holiday easier. They have to be away from their family, and I think it kind of brings out the best in people. We were just talking yesterday, I believe it was, about how some of the Christmases were here, and a couple folks were recalling how one of the RTAs, rehab therapy assistants, who did the shopping for the clients, she would make sure every client had at least 40 gifts.
Wow.
So it was, of course, that varied from unit to unit, and just how energetic the people who were making the purchases were. But and we've had issues where clients that we were ready to transition, we had to wait till after the holidays because it would become such a period of anxiety, and people would be really worried about ho ho. We had one gentleman, he would say ho 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 ho, and that was all he could think about for from this time of year on till after January 1st. So we had to postpone the transition based on his obsession with Santa and Christmas and all those things.
It's by tradition for them.
Yeah. And we had a conversation yesterday and assumed that probably a lot of the folks who leave here don't have quite the Christmases that they out there that they had here.
So it was a huge deal.
It was a huge deal.
Yeah. There were auxiliary people that came in and did things.
Volunteers would come in, and they would have the Santa's workshop, they called it. Families' gifts weren't allowed to be brought in wrapped. If they did come in wrapped, they had to be unwrapped and rewrapped. And I don't know, I don't know who brought a weapon into their son or daughter or what happened. But
Files and cakes.
Files and cakes, yeah. But they had to be rewrapped, and everything had to be inspected. And now I will say there was a lot of theft that went on of new client items. Not just before they got marked, but sometimes after they got marked, they would disappear too. Several people would lift things that they thought their son or daughter might enjoy. We've actually had people come in, especially after the holidays, wearing client-owned clothing that had been marked with the client's name. One lady lost her job because she was wearing a pair of tennis shoes that actually had the client's name written inside the instep. So, you didn't have to be a rocket scientist to work here. And a lot of people didn't have very good moral values. But yeah, I think that a lot of the more caring staff especially kind of tried to make it up to the clients the rest of the year. Of course, they used their own money to do it. A lot of it, people's Christmas gifts came out of their account more than not.
So
Out of the client. Okay.
The client
Yeah.
fund, right.
Yeah.
So why do you think people came to work here?
Well, I think that a big part of it's the same reason people still come to work here. It's for the amount of physical labor that's expected, for the requirements. It's still a very good paying job. We have DST staff here that make $13 to $18 an hour, which is more than they're going to make in any factory. There's going to be a little more leniency about, time issues. The state has wonderful benefits. And a lot of people are kind of steeped in the generations. This is where my mom worked. This is where my grandma worked. This is where, my grandfather was working. So I think there's a lot of that too.
Do you think many people came to work here because they wanted to work with people with disabilities?
I don't think that was the big pull. Now, that's not to say that there aren't a few people. I would say that I just can't say that was the biggest reason. There are some people that once they got into the position, they really enjoyed the work that they were doing. But I don't think that was the major draw.
So would it be fair to say that initially it was it could be compared to just a factory job. I'm going to go in there and it's a factory job. I'm going to do the same sort of thing day in, day out. And
I think you could compare it to a factory job in that the requirements were about the same. You know, I think that though we might have attracted people who had better people skills to this line of work than you might attract to the factory work.
mm-hmm.
But I don't think it necessarily means that they would be happier working with this population, working with the elderly, or, you know, working in a hospital or anything. I think you would find that the people who came out here usually at least had a tolerance for working with people, and maybe not a tolerance for working with machines.
Did they get a lot of training? You know, new staff would get a lot of training, so they
There
would
was a lot
understand
of
what
training.
their job should.
And there were a lot of people who came out here with the thought that they would come in and they would do their 4 to 6 weeks of training and then they would leave. That they were coming in to be paid to train people who would do that. And then a lot of them who had come in with that idea, well, this is a short way to make some money,
mm-hmm.
did stay and just stayed 30, 40 years. You know, but yes, there was extensive training and it was paid as if you were on the unit.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of people thought that was going to be fairly easy.
What about fear? Was there ever a time that you were afraid here, or that you were scared that you'd be hurt or injured?
Oh yeah, I've been hurt. I've had my, you know, eye blackened and I've gotten bit and different things, but no, I was never. I've been hurt and I've known it was going to happen, but not really afraid. The kind of things of fear that you have around here is like the angst of going through survey. I've been relieved of job duty so many times over alleged abuse because I was evening shift administrator and I was the first line when someone was misbehaving, and it was usually someone who was verbal, who learned that if I just say, Cindy hit me, even though, you know, I would never be alone in a room with this person,
mm-hmm.
and there would be 15 people who saw that I didn't hit him, he would know that I'd be off at least a week away from clients because I had to undergo investigation. I took a 6-month stress leave because of the anxiety over being relieved of duty so many times over those kind of issues.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so no, not fear for my person, but maybe fear for my profession, for my sanity.
Uh-huh.
I'm fearing for my sanity right now. We're
Right,
in transitions, you know.
Would you say other staff, maybe more direct care staff, would say they were insecure or felt?
I would say you probably would find a few, but I don't think that you would find very many people who stayed that felt that they were physically threatened.
Mm-hmm.
I talked with a lady yesterday about a client we're getting ready to place, and he has a bad reputation. He's broken jaws. He's been extremely violent in the past. She said that, and she is his preferred staff.
Mm-hmm.
She said he was aggravated. He came up to her really fast, and though this man's 350 pounds, she said, I thought he was going to rip my head off. She said, he reached down, he grabbed me, and he kissed me on the cheek. So she said, I thought he was going to kill me, but he didn't. Now, she might say, yeah, I had a moment's fear,
Mm-hmm.
you know, at that point, but never to the point it would make her not want to work with that person. I think, at least since I've been here, not to say people haven't been put off duty. You know, we have had some extremely violent people who've lived here,
Mm-hmm.
but for the most part, we usually get help to the people who need it. We've had a rich enough staffing pattern that you wouldn't be alone in the room with someone who was really violent and risk, you know, being knocked unconscious before you could get help. So, I don't think that fear is that big of a deal.
So what was the best part of your job, or what would you say was the most rewarding part of your job while you've been here?
Probably now. The most rewarding thing is that when we find just the right match of provider and residence for a person to leave here and to get into the community and to do some really cool activity that they would never have a chance to do out here. Yeah, I'd say placement. Although when anything goes wrong in placement, you're always the one to blame. If a client dies in the community, people die here. But if a client dies in the community, I guess I'm getting into my next question because you're looking down at your.
Yeah, I'm just. But no, so yeah, that's one of the things we're trying to do. I mean, it's hard to interview you and get your stories going because we really want to just hear stories.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, the things that we want to know are just your memories of this place, good, bad, what you're going to miss, what you've enjoyed. So if you can just kind of talk at will along those sorts of things, that'd be good too.
I have really enjoyed some of my more difficult people that I've worked with. When I was evening shift administrator, we had a client here who was extremely aggressive. And I bonded with her, and I would come over. She would actually have her staff page me to come over and French braid her hair in the evenings and tickle her arm. She's autistic, and she liked to have her arm tickled. And whenever there was a problem, they would call me because I was a person that could talk her out of feeling bad and talk her out of hitting people and hurting other people. It's those feelings where you feel like there's something about you that's special to someone else. I've really enjoyed working with the worst of the worst kind of people out here, people who have a reputation. One gentleman who came in staffed by 5 people, is someone that I just have so much affection for now. And, just to talk and laugh with him and tell him when my birthday is, because those things he always asks. And just the fact that I've memorized his birthday, and that makes him so happy that someone else actually knows his birthday. And those kind of things. Another thing that I've really enjoyed is the staff camaraderie. And I've always found a way to find it, even if I'm not in a really good situation. Like right now, we're under a lot of stress in this department. But we have great camaraderie, and we are so supportive of one another, and there's almost never a day that one of us isn't having a really terrible day, but that you've got at least, half a dozen other people who are right there with you, and, they'll support you, they'll pitch in, they'll help where they can with the job duties. I've worked in several different positions. I've been a case manager in 5 different areas before I became evening shift administrator. In every one of those areas, I found a way. I found people in that area to have camaraderie with. So, and that was pretty good.
You mentioned people dying, obviously.
Yeah.
People die.
Right.
Both in and out of the
institution.
A story about maybe both situations, just what happened, what do you remember about it?
Wow.
Yeah. Not a very happy subject. We'll come back to something a little more pleasant after that.
Promise?
I promise.
Okay. I had been working on 14 A floor. I was down to a caseload of just the men on 14A, and I had 12. That was when the case managers were doing basically rehab therapy with their caseload too. So I wasn't schooled at. My people weren't real into rehab because they were all in wheelchairs and they just sit around. I had 3 favorite clients, and inside 3 weeks, 2 of those people died. One was a gentleman who had been born normal, had developed a brain tumor, which was removed at the age of 6, and his mother told me before the operation, he said, "Mommy, will I be retarded when this is over?" And of course, Mom was terribly scarred over the whole ordeal, and him being here, and she came to see him every weekend, long drive, and he had there was a degeneration going on in his brain, and he ended up his digestive system shut down, and he aspirated because nothing was going out, and they laid him down to sleep, and it just came back and in his lungs, and he died. Within 3 weeks, I had another gentleman who was a PKU baby. You see these people who had they been born 20 years later, we'd have been able to fix this. They wouldn't be here. He would sit and clap and yell, and he would take your hand if you asked him, and he would calm down to some extent. I just had a real close feeling with him, and I don't know why. It was not like he could talk, or he wouldn't even make eye contact, but I just felt very close to him. And he had a lung infection and passed away. As far as people dying in the community, I think the thing that's always going to stick in my mind was a lady who left here very high functioning, in fact was mistaken for staff much more than not. Better groomed than most of the staff, better read than most of the staff. Somehow she managed a diagnosis, and she was here for a period of time, and she was placed in the community with a provider. And although I wasn't the transition person who placed her, I was aware of her case and what was going on at the time. She ended up getting angry in the home, walking off and getting hit by a car in the Columbus area. And because I knew that I never would have asked for any special precautions for this person just because of her level of skill. I would have thought she was every bit as safe as I would be to walk away, to have a bad day. And it made us all feel terrible when it happened. But it was also like the anti-placement people rallied behind that too here. And it was, see what happens when we let them put our people out. People in the community can't take care of our people. Crap happens everywhere. And that was kind of, there was a big part of me that just said, this is just the kind of thing that happens in the world. The world's unfair. But as far as having a direct effect on me, aside from missing her and feeling terrible that it happened, it was one of the things that made it harder and harder and harder to do what we thought was the right thing in our job here and trying to get more people into the community. I think there was a rallying cry behind that incident, but I still will think that the majority of the opposition to placement has been people fearing for their jobs and their livelihood, which is a pretty natural thing. Anyway, that's my take on death.
Thank you.
Okay.
I know that was hard. Positive. Let's flip over to somebody that you really liked that's worked out well. Just, you enjoyed them and the outcome has been good. Give you enough people.
There's just too many, really. Yeah, there's gentleman lives in Columbus now. Really difficult person to like some days, but he had good days too. Now he's out in Columbus and he's mowing yards, like 20 yards he has. He's a regular entrepreneur. I just heard a story about a gentleman older gentleman who did not want to leave. Very, very adamant this was home. Has been involved in the hippotherapy program. Came out to meet up with people to go to his regular hippotherapy program after he'd been placed in the community for a week. Told the staff, I sold my house out here. I bought me one in town. When they told me, he said that was just hilarious. But yeah, lots of people have more peace of mind than they've ever had in their life. Not to say that there's not times when people are genuinely bored because they have staff who want to sit around and watch TV. There's things we've got to get around. We've got to find the happy medium between the rigid active treatment expectations of the institution and the more lax waiver standards that let people kind of get by with uninvolvement, and it's not fair. You know, people say, well, I would want to sit around and watch TV all day myself if that was my opportunity, but we need to find something in between where people can relax and retire when they're retirement age, but yet they keep them involved and happy.
Leland was the first one.
That's right, Leland.
Leland?
I didn't know.
Remember Leland?
No.
Oh, okay, I thought you knew. I worked with him in the Columbus workshop, so that's
I probably didn't
and
see
he's
him.
lived here for probably the first 20 years, I think, or more. Maybe
That's short term out here.
yeah, maybe into his mid-20s. He's probably about my age, I guess. He's in his 50s, I guess, or early 50s at the latest. Yeah, somebody that I've kind of tracked as we've gone through all this, too.
Cindie, what do you think about this bus closing? What's your take on it? I guess two-part. What's the transition been like for people that work here and people that live here? And then what do you think about the closing?
Man, I've always seen everything in shades of gray. I can't say anything is one way or the other. I know that there are a lot of people who took advantage of educational opportunities, have gotten nursing degrees, have made more of their lives than they ever would have without, and I'm talking about staff right now, without the closure announcement. Some people I don't think will ever really recover. Some people have missed the retirement deadline by weeks, months. Probably will never have the income level or the sense of professional accomplishment that they did here. We're losing 2 social workers that, and they're laying them off at the end of this month for no apparent reason. There's only the 2 and they're just going to get rid of them, even though we still have several clients left. I don't like what it's going to become. I don't like the idea that this facility is going to be turned into a Homeland Security training ground. I'm glad they're going to do something with it, but all that kind of offends my liberal sensitivities that this is going to be a military installation. On the other hand, I think that many people here have an opportunity to have a better life than they ever would have had. Had this facility remained open, we never would have had the chance for many of the people who've left here to have the kind of lives they're going to have, residents. But on the other hand, right now with the impetus to cut funding from the waiver program especially, we are fighting tooth and nail to get just the minimal services for people as they're leaving now, to the point I think that the transition team alone is suffering migraines and ulcers at a rate, never before. I really don't think that the state's done a good job doing what they're doing. They started off promising the moon, the stars, the planets to families, telling families they would have a choice, and telling families that the services would be at least as good, if not better, than they had here. And I think many people, especially as we get down to the end, are not going to have as good a services as they have here. And we have a handful of people that I truly do feel this was the best atmosphere for them, either because they have a combination of medical and behavioral issues. One gentleman that I've been working with just got turned down by the best nursing home for MRDD populations in Indiana because his behavioral issues are too severe. And now I'm totally stymied on what we can do with him because he needs both intensive medical support and intensive behavioral support, which he gets here, but yet the systems in the community aren't really set up for. One gentleman that will probably end up at Madison State Hospital. Just because his aggression is so severe, I don't think that we would be able to give him the supports he needs in the community, even though that wasn't what his mother wanted. You know, like I say, just a handful of people, I feel, won't be as good off, won't be better off, and as. But by and large, all in all, you know, if I try to weigh every ounce of good and bad, I think this is probably the best thing to close. I think more people will benefit from it closing than will suffer from it closing.
Do you think that's the general consensus with most of the staff and most of the families now, after people have had time to accept that it's, you know, really happening?
I don't really have my finger on the pulse of that. We put people out. 9 times out of 10, we hear that the family's real happy with what happened. And then because our concentration has to be on putting the next group of people out, we don't get to remain attached to that. Perhaps if we get to be in outreach at some point, which outreach will probably only be addressing issues of people who are having failings rather than successes. I would say that people forget that they're satisfied quicker than they forget they're unsatisfied. So you're going to hear a whole lot more from families who are not happy with the process, not happy with the result, than you'll hear from people who are happy. So I can't say there's that consensus. I know a lot of people are happy, but...
Music, Redwood Trail, produced by Indiana Institute on Disability and Community, Center for Health Equity, funded by the Indiana Governor's Council for People with Disabilities. Copyright 2019, the Trustees of Indiana University.